Hi guys. So the game I have to share with you today is a really good example of why you should simply never give up in chess. I mean, obviously some games when your position totally collapses and it's just going to be a rout for your opponent, then we all give up games. Sometimes there's not much point, but in this game today, you'll see I went down significantly in material. I was definitely in a losing position. But what happens when the advantage in a game tips? That's one of those really important psychological points in a game where if you are determined, and if you're like material down, you're in a losing position, it's possible to get a psychological edge on your opponent, because if you're the one who's just gone up and you think, oh, I'm 4 or 5 points up in a game, I ought to be able to finish this and finish it quickly, you can get overexcited and you can get clumsy and you can get loose and careless with your play. So let's go through this game. So I'm playing a player called Tom Draper in the USA, rated 1249. I was rated around 1400 at the time. So Tom opens with d4, and I think I'll do the lion kind of approach, and with d6. This can quite often wrong foot your opponent. Now he plays a very odd move with f4, so exposing his king, making it practically impossible to castle on the king side. And even looking at what chess.com, this says queen's pawn opening. It doesn't even have a name for this opening, so it is weird. And I'm starting to get excited at this point, thinking I should be able to capitalize on this. So I play the standard knight to f6. Then he plays another pawn move, and I'm thinking this guy doesn't know what he's doing too much. So I decide to go in for e5. Now, this is actually a mistake on my part, because I'm thinking, okay, if he captures with if he captures the f pawn, I can recapture with my d pawn, and then if he recaptures with his d pawn, queen takes queen, king has to capture queen, and king loses castling rights, and that's worth it. Now, but what I failed to realise is that he could have just taken with the d pawn straight away, and if I'd recaptured with d, he could have taken my queen, and it would have worked against me. Fortunately, he didn't notice that, so he brought out his knight to c3, and I decide to relieve that situation by capturing. Queen comes out. Okay, so I'm feeling fairly comfortable. My pawns are, I got my 3 on my king side, my 3 on my queen side. I'm feeling quite comfortable with that. So obvious move is to bring the knight out to start to kick the queen around the board, see if I can get some good development at the queen's expense. He plays a check. I block with the bishop. Now, I remember saying to myself at this point, I've got an option of 2 bishops to block with. I could also block with a queen or with a knight. So I could have blocked here with the dark squared bishop to e7, or I could have blocked with this one. I decided to block with the light squared bishop, but again, that's another mistake. So I'm, always be careful if you ever think that you've got the edge on a game, or you've got the edge on your opponent. That should be a little red flag in itself. Never allow yourself to get too comfortable in chess. So I play this, and can you see the obvious threat here? My bishop obviously is pinned straight to there, and look at this f pawn, this wild f4 move on, was it move 2? Suddenly that pawn now becomes a real problem. So my bishop is under threat, and it looks as though my bishop's clearly going to get captured. So what I do now is I think, okay, I'm assuming that because I'm about 150 points higher rated than my opponent, I'm assuming that he's, he should be starting on the back foot kind of psychologically, as though I've got maybe more in my repertoire, more in my armoury than he might. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to take some time. Now, so I do take a little bit of time on this, 12 seconds on this move, but I see something pretty quickly, and I see the threat of knight takes c2 with a triple fork on the king, the queen, and the rook. And this turns out to be a trickier problem than you might think. Obviously, white can't just go ahead and capture the bishop, because I capture c2 and his queen is going to fall. So how can he defend c2? He could move his queen to here, in which case I move my bishop out of the way and he loses that valuable piece. He can't move the queen to there because the knight will capture it. And there really are no other decent moves. And well, in fact, if he moves like the queen there, my bishop can just take the pawn. So the only realistic move, actually, to prevent that horrible fork is king to d1, losing his ability to castle, but at least he maintains the pin on the queen. I then see that I've got two knights now looking at d5, so I can move one there, attack the queen, force the exchange of knights, recapture with my other knight, and again renew that threat on the queen. He took a minute over that last move. So if you look at the time now, he's taken 4 minutes so far. I've taken only 1. So I've definitely, we could say, been rushing at this point. Now I do know that he has queen to e4, maintaining the pin on the bishop. So my bishop is going to fall. So I take just another attack on the queen. I just move my knight back, attack the queen again. Queen moves back to e3, and I think I'm out of options at this point. I'm going to have to say goodbye to that bishop. So I move my queen there, preparing to castle queenside. His king has now moved to d1, which means if I castle kingside, my rook is going to end up there on d8, and that's a good thing. I've got a major piece lined up with his king. And I'm going to capture with the f-pawn, capture towards the centre, build up a nice pawn structure on the queen side there. So, looking at the board, looking at the game, he has a bishop, and I have one extra pawn on the board. I also like my pawn structure more. I've got a pawn island of 5 and a 2 there on the king side. He has a 3 and a 2, and then an isolated pawn in the middle there on e2. So I'm thinking at this point I've got reasonable compensation for my lost bishop. He brings out his knight. Now, of course, what he should be doing is starting to bring his pieces towards my king. His knight needs to come into the play. He wants his bishop into the game, both bishops into the game as well. When you've got a piece advantage, you want to be using your pieces, right? When you've got a pawn advantage, you want to be thinking about how you use your pawns. It's all about maximizing your strength, minimizing your weaknesses. So I come back at the queen again. I'm moving my knight more into the center of the board. It's in a nice protected place there on d5, and I can even think about, renewing my ideas, my attacks now, maybe looking towards f2 now that the king's had to move across. Queen moves across, now threatening b7, and I've got a couple of options here. I could have castled queenside, but I figure moving my knight there in the way is equally good. Comes down with a not very challenging attack on my queen. Queen moves out the way. Knight then comes in, and I'm starting to think now, okay, this guy's starting to organise himself. He's starting to think quite well. He knows he's up on material. This bishop here on g5 is annoying because it's stopping my king from castling because it can't pass through d8. I push my pawn forward, so I have 2 pawns in the middle, d and e files. He only has the 1, so I want to press home my advantage and get that central control. He reacts with a pawn move, and I think now it's time to get that bishop off that diagonal, that h4 to d8 diagonal. I don't want it there, and so I go for the double pawn push, h6, g5, forces the bishop back here. This pawn is defended by the queen, but I think it's time to castle anyway. And we're in a relatively equal position at this point in time. Now White moves his knight down. Clearly my a7 pawn is undefended at the moment, so I move my king across. Noticing that my king is in line with the bishop now. So I'm going to need to do something. And this is what I failed to realise. This was definitely a mistake. So he comes in. Now he has two attackers on c7. Yes, I have two defenders, but his attackers are both minor pieces and my defenders are king and queen. So, I mean, I don't know what else I could have done at that point, really. So the risk is that his knight captures on a7. I guess my other option was to push a6, but still, you know, he's still got those two attackers on there, so it doesn't really change the situation. So bishop comes in and captures c7. Now I'm thinking, okay, I've still got some king protection on this side. So this isn't the end of the world, and sometimes losing pawns when you want to open up the game, when you want to bring your rooks into the game in particular, can be a good thing. So I'm not worried too much, and I'm thinking, okay, now clearly I'm not going to take with the queen. I'm not going to exchange my queen for two minor pieces. That isn't an option. So I'm thinking, well, what's going to happen is now I'm going to be sacrificing one of these pieces. And obviously I'm in check, so I have to move my king out of the way. Now, what I'm thinking at this point is that actually maybe he would have been better to capture the knight. Force me to take back with my a pawn, thereby giving me doubled pawns, and he's got that knight in a very threatening position. However, he can't move his queen to a3 because of my bishop, and he can't move his queen to a4 because of my knight. So, but he could have moved the queen, say, to c3 with the threat of coming in. So there are threats there. He decides to take the bishop, I recapture the queen, and he moves his queen across. Okay, so now I am 5 material points down. I'm basically a full rook behind in material. He's used more time. He actually took 2 minutes on that last move, that queen move. I have 3 pawn islands as well now because I've lost my c pawn. Just for some, basically just not thinking enough. I've got 25 minutes still on the clock and I'm potentially in a losing situation already. I realised that him moving his queen across the c3, he is now threatening my rook on h8, which is undefended. So I decide to move my bishop out off the back rank so that my queen is defending the rook. Now he moves his knight in with a half-hearted check, but he is also forking e6. I have to move my king. Now he captures e6 with an attack on the queen, and it's all starting to look a bit perilous for black at this point in time. But I still have 25 minutes on the clock. He's still got 18. Brings out a minor piece. This is good. I can't capture with the queen because then the queen would capture my rook with a nasty situation. So I move my queen across to the only safe square. I could have moved it to c8, but then white could have forced an exchange of queens, and with 6-point advantage now that would have been overwhelming. So the queen now comes in with a check. This isn't too bad. I can move my king to a8. Queen comes in and grabs yet another loose pawn. I now move my queen across to help in the defense of my king. White develops a rook onto the open f file. Good move. I pressure the bishop. Now comes in with a check, and I move my king out of the way. He moves his bishop out of the way. I start to attack b2, which is loose and undefended, and the rook comes across. Move my king now back. He attacks the queen, and this was maybe a mistake on white's part. Yes, he's 6 points in front, but that, how long did he take? He took 41 seconds. Hang on, no he didn't. 31 seconds over this move, and basically blunders a minor piece. I capture, and clearly it still makes sense. So he has just blundered a minor piece for no real gain in the game. And now he decides to kick my knight away, but this is basically 2 blunders and 2 moves. So he's got his material advantage. He's now starting to throw it away because my knight now has c3 with a fork on the king and the rook. Clearly it's not always obvious, so do I want to exchange my knight that's worth 3 points for a rook that's worth 5 at this point in the game when I'm that far behind? Does it make that much of a difference? I decide it is worth it at this point, because what we're going to be left with here, when we look at the board now, I've got 5 pawns, he's got 6. So the difference now is 4 material points. He has a light square bishop. Now, if I can move all of my pawns onto dark squares and keep all of my pieces on dark squares, that light square bishop is going to have relatively little impact on the game. So what I'm looking at is how can I minimize my opponent's advantages or strengths and maximize my own. So I decide to attack a loose pawn. Another option here would be maybe rook to f8, pinning the bishop on the rook. So now he couldn't move the bishop or the rook because I would capture the other. In fact, he could have moved the bishop back to d3, defending the rook. So that wasn't such a good idea. Okay, and now we're in an ending. I centralize my rook. He moves his bishop back, b5. So I'm trying to reduce the options for his bishop now. I move my rook back to defend my rearmost pawns, which makes sense. He pushes a pawn up, king towards the centre. Another pawn move, and I'm just moving my king backwards and forwards here, actually. Because I realise if he maybe plays a4, captures b5, I recapture, that still isn't too bad. If he pushes this pawn, that would be a huge mistake, so I capture with d with a fork. So I'm quite comfortable here. I'm happy to sit back. My opponent has 10.5 minutes now left on the clock. And now, at this point, I'm starting to think I want to use the clock as a weapon. I want to give him things to think about. I want to make life difficult for him and let his time start running down in the hope that that will provoke a mistake. Move my king back. I've got no reason to stop pushing up the board. I definitely don't want to be moving these pawns on dark squares up there because that's just going to run into trouble. So what he needs to be doing is he needs to be thinking about, okay, how can I drive home my material advantage? How can I exchange rooks off the board if possible? How can I start clearing away pawns? So he takes a pawn there, I recapture, and this is okay for me. I'm quite comfortable there on the right side of the board. He pushes a pawn, I capture, bishop captures with check, I simply move my king out of the way. He moves g4, I attack the loose bishop, just move back. So I'm in no hurry at this point, and go in with a check. I figure if that would be a mistake if he moves his king into d3, then I can play rook f3 and snatch the h-pawn. He's more sensible than that, moves his rook up. Again, I go back and attack 2 pawns. And I did think about this. So I knew that he could come in with check, and then my king can come across and attack his bishop. Now he can't go and capture the h-pawn because king will take bishop. My rook also has the option of attacking or capturing 2 different pawns, but he decides to go ahead and he thought for 45 seconds about that. Maybe he's thinking that this pawn is worth it from a strategic point of view. Getting rid of that pawn over there on the left hand side of the board is worth it because he'll be able to then convert his pawns, and it's worth sacrificing his bishop. I don't know. I can only assume he did. I took the bishop without thinking. He then comes up and attacks g5. So I go across and capture a pawn. He captures the pawn. I capture a pawn. Now his material advantage, which was +6 earlier on in the game, is now reduced to +1. He's only 1 pawn ahead. and he's got just under 6 minutes left on the clock. He goes and captures my final pawn. Now, I have no possibility of getting a queen in the game. I attack the pawn, he comes back and defends. I start to move my king towards his other pawn. And really, this should be an overwhelming advantage for white now. He doesn't have to do much. He's got my king is actually trapped into this part of the board now because his rook is here. Okay, and that's one of the things you definitely want to be doing in an endgame. But likewise, his king is also trapped at the top end of the board there by my rook. So he moves down, letting my king out of that box, which is a little bit odd. His king can't defend the pawn now because of my rook. So that was a rash move, I think, on his part. He pushes his pawn down. I grab his pawn. Again, now we're down to one pawn game. And this is where some knowledge of endgames is going to come in. Now, his idea now is that this g-pawn is going to march its way up the board and eventually become a queen. However, his rook is in front of his pawn, which means that at some point his rook is going to have to step away in order to let his pawn through to queen there on g8. Now, I'm now thinking, okay, what he's going to want to do is move his rook across with check at some point. So he's going to want to move his rook down to g8, his pawn then up to g7, and then when the time is right, move the rook off g8 with check and get a queen and then win the game. So I'm thinking, how can I prevent that? Obviously, he's still a few moves away from queening. I have just under 20 minutes left to think. So clearly I need to move my king over towards that pawn. He advances the pawn. I pin the pawn. The rook now can't move or else I'll lose his last pawn. King moves. I move across. And this is another blunder. I mean, it really is a blunder to lose your only remaining pawn in that way. How long did he take over that? 2 seconds he took over that last move. Right? He decides to move the rook away from the pawn. And now we are in a situation where he's got 4 minutes 44 left on the clock. I'm on 1932. And I'm starting to think, is it possible to win the game at this point? Right? He's shown that he will make rash moves under pressure. He's definitely under pressure. He's got under 5 minutes left of a 30-minute game. And now it's what I have to do is I have to be cool and I have to be mean. And this is the thing. When you are behind in a game, you want to be cool and you want to be mean. You really want to look for the most horrible, calculated moves that you can. And when you are ahead in a game, you want to be cool and mean. Right? So, one thing I just need to be sure about is I don't want to leave my king and my rook on the same file or the same rank. What I absolutely need to avoid is his rook coming in and skewering my king, so it has to move out the way, and then he comes in and grabs my rook. As long as he can't capture my rook, I have a chance. Moves his king across. I'm thinking, okay, swing my rook round, hopefully there to a2, and capture his rook. He moves his king back, I move my rook to a2. Now, there would have been one catastrophic move, which would have been d1. Clearly he doesn't play that. I have no interest in exchanging rooks. I'm 150 rating points higher. I do not want to draw in this game because that would have meant I would have lost rating. Moves his king across. I just move my king across, always making sure that my king and my rook are not going to be lined up at any point. The check is not an issue. Check is not an issue. Now he doesn't have another check. So he moves his king across. I move my rook in. Another check. Moves his king into the corner. I throw in a check. He blocks. Move back. Rook moves. King comes in to press. Check. Out the way. Check. Out of the way to there. He doesn't have another check because my king would be able to capture the rook. He moves his rook back. And rook to e1 is checkmate. Okay? So, as I predicted, and he had three and a half minutes left on the clock, but what happened here was some basic endgame errors, really, basically kind of lack of understanding of some simple endgame theory, that he managed to allow his king to be squeezed into the corner in this way, and there's really no reason why it should ever have been pushed into the corner. But you know that the only way to lose a game by checkmate when your opponent only has a king and a rook is it has to be on the edge of the board, right? There's no other way that I could have ever secured checkmate unless he'd moved his king onto the edge of the board. So rule number one, don't move your king to the edge of the board. And let's see why does he do it? His king can now move straight at the f-file, that's not a problem, but he moves towards the corner, and that's a mistake. So I'm just pressing in towards his king. So I want to be like one square away from his king to prevent his king from being able to come into the center of the board, and I'm pressing him now to the corner. Again, so you can see my king and rook are trying to press in, and that's how it finishes. There are very, very few ways to achieve checkmate with a king and a rook, but he managed to trap himself using his own rook. So what is the lesson? Never give up, never retreat, never surrender. If there's any hope at all in a game, you can learn a lot by rescuing or working with a situation that seems lost or seems very difficult. And at this level, when you're not playing Masters, when you're not playing in a high club level, you can rely on the fact that an opponent who gets a material advantage can sometimes get drunk on that, can get giddy on that, and can make mistakes. So it's a great opportunity to practice being calculating, being rational, being mean, be cool, take your time. There are so many opportunities to win games that may seem lost. I definitely recommend it, and it's a great feeling to be able to rescue a game that your opponent should have won, and we all know how much it hurts because we've all done it, right? How many games have you been ahead in material and then you've just become careless and you throw the game away, and that really stings. But it's great to be able to rescue a lost position. So I hope you've learned as much from this game as I did today. I'll see you in the next video.